Alright, so this is Burne Hogarth. Burne Hogarth is my savior. Burne Hogarth is where I first kind of discovered the z-axis. He doesn't really talk about it, he doesn't really refer to it as the z-axis in any specific place that I remember anyway. When I was a kid, I wasn't really looking for that specific terminology, but as I grew older and I took more like science-based work at school, I kind of just developed a specific term for it, and that's when I started calling it the z-axis. Of course, I didn't invent that term, it's been around, I just discovered it for myself. And Burne Hogarth is where I discovered it before that. And it's it's amazing the way he just really perfectly illustrates the presence of the z-axis, the presence of the angle, these right angles that he's drawing. And these angles, the way he drew this specific image, he drew it as digits that slowly shrink as they go, but because they're shrinking, the three-dimensional z-axis is not lost. It's still very prevalent in his diagram, and there's a specific reason for that. Of course, because the hand is three-dimensional. And that's something that you guys forget very, very much. And that's what makes it so difficult to draw hands. That we are trying to draw objects that are three-dimensional as two-dimensional, imagine laying your hand on a paper and then outlining around your hand, removing your hand and then cutting out your hand. That hand is going to be very floppy that you just cut out of the paper, that cutout. And that is how you guys draw hands. The equivalent of the real life version of your hands is that floppy paper. None of you think about how the cube is having a shadow on the side of it, just along here. And that's why it's very difficult for you guys to know the gradients from light to dark when you draw, and also figuring out the difference between bone and fat. So that's another big thing about hands. So the first big thing about hands, let me just get a layout set up. Oh, it's too dark. Okay, so the first and most important thing about hands is the fact that they are three-dimensional. So fingers are three-dimensional. And because you guys forget this, you guys don't know where to place the shadow and where to place the light when it comes to shading the fingers. You guys do pretty much this for every finger that you draw. You guys pretty much draw like this. You have a shadow on the outside, and then you just shade in between until it starts looking like a sausage. So the way you guys draw is you guys draw cylindrical fingers, which is the biggest no-no, because that's not how they work. Very specifically because in the bone structure, the fingers are closer to the top. The bone is closer to the top where the nail is. So the bones settle over here and the fat settles over here. So when we're drawing a hand that we're looking down upon, with the knuckles being here and the fingers being here, there's a lot of fingers, you guys still draw the sausage. Even though technically from this angle looking top down, we see mostly fingers and we see mostly bones, which is where the side, this specific angle here, is visible. So this first thing here is what I'm going to be looking for in the hands you guys drew. And remember, the more work you give to me, the more I can teach you guys. So the class is entirely propelled by your work. This is a critique hour. This isn't a lesson hour or whatever. The lesson is embedded into the critique. So the more homework you guys give me for Thursday, the more I'll be able to do. I already said the theme weeks can be pushed up to 2 hours. So the more you guys give me, the more I can talk about. So let's take a look here if you guys did that. Dark to light, and then dark to light. Well, the light is hovering in between. This is your standard understanding of hands. This makes it look very three-dimensional. So that's a mistake this person has done. Let's take a look at Kuro. Kuro was a little more courageous. He saw the light sitting on the top. But there is also, the closer you get to this hand here, which I'm going to come to next, the closer you get to the fat. The further away you move from the fat, the closer you get to the bone. So over here, we're going to have more immediate edges that don't blend together. Over here, there might be an edge that we're seeing. So it's Burne Hogarth. What he does very specifically and beautifully is that he continues that angle, that 90-degree angle, all the way across the tip of the finger. Or some of you might appreciate it only up until the lower part of the finger or the lower third of the finger. And then that's really where it gets most mild, the edge, because it gets closer to the fat of the palm. And that's really one of the most important things to remember. How do you detail a hand? I used to remember doing hand studies and painting hands on my portraits, and I'm like, how do you detail a hand? What do I do next? And it's really just making sure when not to blend this 90-degree angle and when to blend it. You blend it when there is more fat padding, because fat is going to create gradients. So this is when you increase the size of your brush, and this is when you start blending in very smooth lines, because it is still skin and fat. But when it comes to bone, hands are the boniest things in our entire body, second to feet. And that's what's making everything so difficult, because all of you artists here sitting today have an inherent difficulty understanding the z-axis. So hands naturally are a difficulty for you. They are an adapted difficulty. Because we forget to treat hands as three-dimensional cubes and rectangles, and we treat them as sausages instead. We think that gradients, shading from this to this, is the best kind of shading. We think this is what art is all about, doing a perfectly blended shade. This is what we think art is. Or at least growing students think art is all about this. They will spend hours blending, making it look perfect and pretty, and they'll think that's what it is. Sometimes art is about doing this and having the courage to do this and not blending, and creating that sharp edge that is needed, that is a necessity to create a reading edge in the inherent real dimensional, three-dimensional bone structure of any anatomy. So that's the first problem. Second problem, three-dimensional is the first problem. The second problem is the fact that we forget about fat versus bone versus muscle. So hands are very difficult because, one, they test your three-dimensional understanding, and then they test your ability to know when. They test your anatomy understanding. So 3D was the first problem. Anatomy in 3D and 3D in anatomy is the second problem. We don't study hands enough. And studying hands doesn't mean going out and memorizing every medical label, every muscle that only a doctor would really have a use for. That doesn't mean that you're studying, memorizing the parts of the hand. That means squat. That means, I'm sorry, shit. That means for nothing. Memorizing the parts of the hand means nothing, because it's not giving me an appropriate amount, an estimate on the time you spent drawing a hand. It just tells me that you're good at memorizing names. What does it do for me as your teacher if I'm trying to teach you? If you want to prove to me that you've done a lot of studies on hands, show me the quantity of studies. Show me. Meaning, you don't have to always be actively, even at that point, you don't always have to be actively drawing a hand. Sometimes sitting there and looking at your hand and actually massaging your hand makes you makes you develop a more intimate understanding of where the muscle really sits, where the fat sits, and where the tendons sit, which is muscle, and where the bone is. And that's really where it's at. If you guys feel your way through, it's like looking at a sculpture. What I always tell my students, when you guys are having trouble drawing eyes, drawing chin, I always say, get some Sculpey or whatever it's called, get some clay and actually sculpt a chin or an eye. Because what it will do is allow you to develop a more intimate understanding of the form. Really how light wraps around the form, how light reveals it. If you move the light around and you keep this sculpture still, what happens to the shadows? How are the lights revealing the shadows? If you leave the light by itself and you rotate the head, how are we seeing the angles distort and compress? So if you guys are having trouble drawing hands, and all three of you here have not drawn completely good hands, this is a photo study, by the way. This is really, I don't see any underworking or underwiring. I would like to see underwiring when you guys draw. Or else it's just a photorealism. What I want to see is real studying. Studying is like, even Da Vinci had sketchbooks full of sketches and studies, and where he showed the symmetry lines and where he showed the gesture lines. So you guys are not exempt from showing me the work. Show me your work. If you've ever been to a math class, the teacher doesn't care if you have the perfect answer. They want to see how you got to it. The work that you, how you got to your work. So how you got to your answer. So showing me the work is like showing me the work in an equation, a mathematics equation. Please show me how you developed it, where the gesture line is. Because that's really what counts. When I say I don't care about anatomy and referencing, what I do care about in anatomy is that you understand the layers of the anatomy, how the mechanics of the hand work. And of course it starts with bone. Bone structure is a very specific part of a hand. It exists and is very visible when a hand moves. It's really compressed and kind of invisible when a hand is stretched out perfectly. And you kind of have to learn where these signifiers are when a hand is bent in any way. You know, there are landmarks, specific landmarks, and this is what Hogarth talks about. Specific landmarks in the anatomy of the hand you always have to look out for that signify that specific movement or that specific gesture. Any hand that is bending has knuckles that are very key in capturing you for you as an artist, so that the person who's looking at the hand can read the hand immediately. Usually the bend calls on these knuckles, so you have to look out for these knuckles. So let's look through these. A stretched out hand, this one is stretched out, there aren't any immediate knuckles. But there is a sort of flatness to this image, and it has to do a lot with the fingers that you've drawn, but thank you for showing me the underwork. Showing me your work is very important. When a hand is stretched out, the kind of the bone structure that is visible is just a three-dimensional structure that is visible, so the side shadow here. So we come back to the old lecture on form. Light reveals form. Form is not visible and not present without light. So asking yourself where the light source is coming from is one of the most important things you can do for yourself, no matter what you're drawing, and hands are not exempt from that. And asking yourself where the light is coming from will help you draw, I guess, a hand that reads a little bit more. So over here, what you're telling me is that you're telling me this edge is so immediate that if I were to look at it from the side, if I were to have a cross section of this finger, it would look like this. The fingertip here is a pyramid. The edges of the finger don't sit there. The edges of the finger sit like a rectangle. This is another, where is it? Another, just like this, where the top faces upward. It really wouldn't make sense if the tip was facing upward. Let's see another one. This is about bones. This is about measurement. Right here, the top face of that cube. You see the cubes that he's always drawing? Cube. He's actually drawing a cube. He's actually drawing the z-axis and the x-axis and the y. Right here. And this is where that really sits. So it's not here, because when you don't blend here, you're telling me this is what's happening. The light shining in, the shadow is being cast downward. And this is the point, this is the 90-degree angle that's not allowing the light to bend through or just go through. This is the shadow. Laser 1, laser 2, parallel. We have the light here. No light here because this is perpendicular. So no light here. And if you're curious about what I just did, this is just the common technique I use to determine whether or not a side of a cube is lit or not, by using this technique. And I have it in my lighting video. It's available on YouTube. So this is the first problem here, that we have excessive detailing and really lack of understanding in the anatomy of fingernails, and you're throwing off the general geometry and structure and mechanics really of the fingers by not blending this point and leaving that unblended edge for the sides, pushing it along the sides. So the hands will read much better as soon as we blend this over. And if the light is coming from the side, simply all you have to do is give this a shade and then just blend it, bring in the background color without blending it in. Sometimes there is no line, and we don't have to constantly frame every finger. Does anyone know what I'm saying when I say framing a finger with shading? Why do you think people frame fingers with shading? Why do you think they do that? Can anyone answer? This is casting a shadow on this. My brush is really, really sharp right now because I'm talking about basically the edge of the finger right now, where the background starts. So that I really need. They scared. Hazuki says they're scared, which is true. They're scared. What they are doing, what are they doing essentially? This is pretty much what they're doing. What are they doing? Does anyone They're still attached to their line art, exactly, to represent the line, exactly. When you are surrounding every finger, every sausage finger that you do, that you paint with a shadow, this is your insecurity, still thinking about where the line is. You're still trying to define it, Because you see, the way you guys learned, or the way you guys remember objects, is not as the actual three-dimensional sculpture of the object. You guys remember symbols. When I say hand, you guys think this. And as artists, we have to think better than this. We're artists. We are the ones who duplicate an image onto a two-dimensional surface. We're the ones who, without the third dimension, bring in the third dimension somehow and project it, an artificial third dimension on the image. This means, essentially, that we are thinking about the cube, the rectangle, however shape the cube was taken, whatever form the cube has taken. This is what we're supposed to be thinking about. And not always is the cube a perfectly framed object. There isn't always a shadow here, something casting a shadow. Maybe this finger, if this finger was lower than this finger, there would be a cast shadow somewhere here. But that would be it. First, identifying where the light source is. And second, finding the edge of the rectangle and not blending. Very simply not blending. The not blending happens a lot closer to the top than it does on the bottom. And kind of tapers off the lower you get because of fat. Over here, this is way too overstated. This contrast is too high. You don't need this much of an overstatement, and this massive jump in the tendons, because what happens is now you're telling me that we've stripped away the skin and looked only at the hand. So this might be a bit gory, but I'm not sure if I should even show it. Let me first find it and make sure it's not too gory. Yeah, it might be too gory. I'll use this one. But this is pretty much the hand without any skin on it. I don't want to freak you guys out, but this is a drawing, so that's why I didn't use any photographs. If you guys want to, look at them at your own time and have a look at what really happens under the skin. This is not what you want to be drawing. Sometimes you guys overcompensate with the detail, and you draw tendons that seem like you've pulled away the skin because that's how defined you draw the tendons. That's not good. That's what you did. Remember, there's this layer of skin and fat sitting on top of the tendons and the, sorry, I just got a message, of the skin and the not the skin, the bone and the tendons and the muscles. What we want to show is that that top layer of skin acts as it blunts away the real edges of that cube in the tendons. So what we have to do first is take away what we know protrudes through the skin, and that's most importantly the muscle, the knuckles. And some knuckles are larger than the others, and this is what Hogarth means by landmarks. He means that find the largest object of the area, and that by finding that helps you find the rest. So no, I'm not showing it. Body worlds, that's really cool. I wish I could go to that. They're the ones that are the actual cross sections of human bodies. Yeah, I wish I could see that. I think that's what it is, right? Anyways, so you find the high point, the highest point of the bone. What do you do to show, if you don't have a line, what do you do to show a high point? Does anyone know? It's weird how they light, high values, light, exactly. So when you're drawing any hand, so this is a hand set that I look at a lot when I'm just painting a portrait or drawing something. And when I'm drawing one of these hands, this is I forget what they're called, Senshi stock hands. They're really great. You guys can find it on their page. When I'm using one of these as a reference, what I do is I actually use one of these for my recent painting. I find the high point. And the high point pretty much is, this is overexposed, so what I do is I run it through grayscale first. I grayscale my reference. I also run Burne tool on midtones just to bring down all the excessive, all the kind of high points that seem like they're artificial, that I want to see a real gradual, darker kind of grayscale spectrum. So I kind of lower the highlights a little bit. And then after I lower the highlights, things still stay bright. One quick motion on midtones, burn tool on midtones, really low opacity or exposure. I find the high points, and these high points are what I use to guide me through the entire image. So this, of course, is the lightest spot on this thumb. Second to this right here. And those are the two areas that will get the largest brush strokes from me. Then I'll find where the z-axis exists, and it's very, very elusive little z-axis. You kind of have to find it. So depending on where the light is coming from, the light is shining down. So we've got light to dark, and then dark a little bit here, dark, light, dark, because of the shadows. There's no reflection here. And then we've got dark, we've got light, light, or dark, light, dark, because of the shadow of this on top of this, and then we've got light to dark. Those are that little thing that I just did. Those are the large brush strokes that I do that can be done in like 30 seconds. Those are what you look for. As you look for the z-axis, the areas that you make dark, that's you actually bringing in the bone structure. So you don't have to sit there and draw a full-on diagram of every single little bone, you don't have to draw a Burne Hogarth sketch every time you draw a hand. You just have to know, with line efficiency in mind and brush efficiency, what you are doing with your brush. What part of the hand anatomy are you representing? And of course, you can't represent hand anatomy without being aware of it first. So again, massage your hands a little bit. Give your hands some love, and that sounds so bad. And actually identify where the bone structures are. Wherever you see real bone jutting out, that's where you are likely should not be blending. So over here and over here, this shadow that he drew is a little bit darker than this shadow, and this is a little bit darker than this, and this is a little bit darker than this, and it goes lighter, because that immediate edge doesn't allow any light in. But the softer the edge gets, the more gradual tone, the lighter, the more ability the light will have to jump in. And then you've got another thing. Hands are just like form studies, and in form studies we explore a lot about reflected light. So when we're looking at a hand like this, we have to think about which part of the hand, maybe this is not a good example, which part of the hand is reflecting light on another part of the hand. So this happens a lot over here. This part of the hand reflects a little bit on this shadow, so the shadow has less potential to be dark, because this is very, very light, casting light back above and giving this shadow less of an immediate edge. But that edge is still there. If you squint your eyes, you will see a beautiful edge right here that is not completely blended. Edge, edge, traveling all the way from this bone, which is a very sharp edge, all the way down. Sharp edge, light. And the more you look for the sharp edge, the easier it will be for you to create a hand that reads without 5 or 6 hours invested into it, because your brush is identifying the specific landmarks of the anatomy. So there's the fact that you're not thinking 3D when you draw hands. You really weren't thinking 3D here. This is, again, I can't look at this anymore because I need the reference for that. And over here, what's happening is that we're not showing off the parts that are fleshy versus the parts that are bony. So over here we would see an immediate bone kind of coming through. We would see areas that are more like what he draws here. Let me see if I can find it. Right here, these areas that jut out. These are very specific landmarks that we're talking about in the anatomy, that if the finger bends even a slight bit, it will show right away. Like right now, I'm bending my finger exactly in the same way that this is bending, and I'm finding all of these little grooves that are missing here. And every hand has these grooves. Every functioning hand has these grooves. Unless we're talking about hands that have excessive fat. When you have a lot of fat, like when you have a corn dog, even if the corn dog stick was a cube, and you wrap that corn dog stick, that is a cube, with a bunch of corn dog, it will lose, of course, its three-dimensional shape. There will just be too much fat. There is no really influence or reference of the third dimension and the cube on that fat. So if there's excessive padding, you really have to start representing them as sausages, because there is very, very little fat. Very, very little bone, lots of fat coming through, distorting the bone. So for this one, I really recommend you look into the bone structure, not only looking out for the large brush strokes or the shadows and the larger shades and lights, but I really want you to look for the bone structure. You have a consistent kind of texture going around. what I need you to do is show me the areas where it is bone, where you're going to draw a very sharp peak, just along here. And as you get closer to the tip, you get closer to the nail, and the nail is a very specific sharpness to it, has a very specific sharpness. So really you have to look out for where the bone is and where the fat is. And basically you're asking yourself, how fat is this hand? And after you ask how fat is this hand, look for the areas that are not so fat, that are three-dimensional. Where am I? And then, of course, something's still bothering me about this hand. Let me zoom out and I'll see it. Okay, so it's the disconnection between the thumb. So this is anatomy here. This is not just shading. This is not technique. This is all knowledge. Right here, the thumb really connects into the wrist a lot quicker. There is no bump. Like, I'm not sure how your hands look like, but I kind of feel like that bump really wouldn't be there. Just by looking at my hands and doing the exact same pose that those hands are doing, there isn't much of a bump. It just connects straight into the fat of the finger. Also, this little bit here is a little too turned out. We are looking directly at the thumb. So the thumb, we're kind of seeing it from the side. Wait a minute. So that's not where that's not what we're moving. Sorry, I couldn't say that. This is what we're moving. Okay, so right here, and the thumb kind of just gets half the thumb becomes not visible. And that leads me to my next fact, which is perspective. Perspective is one of those things that we really forget about when we're drawing hands, and Hogarth also covers that. So basically, in conclusion, not completely yet, but read the Hogarth book if you guys haven't decided on that already. Have a look at that book. He is someone I would feel safe in recommending to you. I'm very cautious of recommending art books, because I kind of just want to make sure that we're not repeating the habits of our past generations in our art. It's kind of like my mission statement, because not enough people, like when we're in kindergarten, who's teaching us about cubes in kindergarten and specific color vocabulary? Nobody. So I kind of want to just nip it in the bud. But Hogarth is one of those people that I feel like you can really benefit from in your art. Burne Hogarth. I'm sure someone can spell that out in chat. So there's that. So let me show you before. The thumb was kind of, you're forcing the side of the thumb to be visible, but by looking at my hand at least, I feel like the thumb is not visible from that side. And then we have the shadow of the palm. So I'm trying to introduce this cube here, and part of the shadow is going to run across. Even if the light is coming from above, this dip is not at the same altitude as this and this. We don't have a knuckle in between here. So the shade we use here and here relatively cannot be the same shade we use in between them. So we're throwing a shadow in there. And that's all stuff you learn from form studies. Form studies will help you do anything faster. They are useful for everything. And I'll talk more about perspective in a second, but I just want to do a complete paint over for this. So here's another tip. Classical artists use this a lot. You got to keep a lookout for it. That's pretty much the only use for doing master studies, by the way. Doing master studies isn't really the best way to learn about light and physics, but it is an amazing way to get into the mind of the artist, see how they were thinking, and get a little bit of a experience with color and how they use color, and how color is very deceiving, and color choice is very deceiving. When something looks green, it's really not green. It's because everything around it has a bit of red in it. So it looks a little bit green compared, but it could be a gray for all you know. So you have to go in there and really experience it. And something that I learned from master studies and from watching people do master studies is that when they are doing edges that are bone, they don't blend. They use a very, very sharp edge. But when they are doing edges that are fatty, like the edge of a cheek or the edge of the palm here, they make it very, very soft. And that's such a tricky little trick they do. But it's really effective. It's effective in creating a feeling, a sort of texture feeling between bone, which is dense matter, and fat, which is squishy matter. You do this especially on the face because the face has all these tiny little hairs on it. And the tiny little hairs on the face cause an even more fuzz, peach fuzz on the side of the cheek when you're doing a 3/4 view. The nails kind of come through, they kind of have a tiny bit of subsurface scattering to them. So you might want to just show where the nails come through. They kind of just blend into the shadow of everything else around them. And it's very important you show the nails. You cannot skip the nails. They are part of the anatomy and the function of the hand. Remember, hand anatomy is function and function is anatomy, and the hand is designed to pick up larger objects, pick up even larger objects with the arm, and then pick up smaller objects with the fingernails. So it's got like multiple uses. It's exponentially useful. And you have to show that this hand can do that as well. You can't always depend on the idea that you're drawing a humanoid. You know, some people get away with really bad anatomy, and then their excuse is that, well, that's not my kind of anatomy. That's, they're from a different world. And that doesn't work anymore. Because it's not always like that. It's not always something, you can't always say that. And that's you kind of dodging the bullet and saying that you don't need to learn any more anatomy, and that as long as you shade well and as long as you're doing that halo, that framing well, you can get away with it. It won't, because it won't look like it can function. Just like an eye. If you don't draw the eyelids of the eyeball, it won't look like it can blink. It'll look really, really weird. Let me look at my hand. At this angle, the pinky and the ring finger almost seem really similar in length. Let me just test it. Maybe one is a little lower. Sorry, I'm not looking at the chat, guys. Okay. And then finally, when it comes back down to the cube, and this is the edge, we have the secondary light source. And I'm using a very, very large stroke for my brush, because it's a very, very large area. What's happening is that this thumb, the lower part of the light, anywhere is coming through and casting some secondary light source. And that's something you have here as well. So this area of the finger is a little more fatty than this area. And this area I'm going to represent with a nice, clean edge. Very, very unblended. I'll even use my hard round brush. Just like this. Oops. And this is coming back. The background is starting. A little fuzzier. And I'll show you the before and after and how it reads. And we've got this area. Of course, always zoom out. And this finger here, it kind of looks like she's pointing. I'm not sure like where you're going with the gesture. So finally, the most important thing about hands, when you're starting them off, this is why I want to see your work for Thursday. If you guys are submitting anything, I want to see the gesture line. Hands are, wherever you have more than one joint, everyone repeat this back to me. Whenever you're dealing with an anatomy that has more than one joint, you have more reason to draw a gesture line, because you have more points at which this anatomy can bend. Meaning you have this little sneaky thing has more potential to have a very unique gesture that is going to be very difficult to reproduce without a line guiding you, a line of motion or a line of gesture. When you're drawing a dragon tail, do you draw a dragon tail scale by scale? Let me just draw this beautiful dragon. I'm just going to draw this dragon. And I'm just really just going to give it my all. Okay, I think that's enough for the dragon tail. Alright, you don't really learn a lot. The dragon, there's no bending happening. What you're going to do if you're too indulged in the detail of the hand, if you're too indulged into the tendons and into the cube, you're going to forget about the most important thing that really just makes this whole thing easier for you, which is the actual fact that this hand can move, that it's an emotion, it's having had moved. I don't know if that makes any sense, but it moved at one point, and it can continue to move if it wants to. If you create hands with the potential of motion, you won't draw stiff shit like this. You won't draw this stiff-ass little Napoleon Dynamite dragon tail. What you will do is that you will start off with the dragon tail's motion and then detail on top. And that's the exact same thing with a hand. So a dragon tail is kind of the extreme version because every single little joint is a motion. Is a as they say in After Effects terminology, what's it? The puppet point. Every single one of these things is a puppet point. I just learned that recently. So that's why this you have more reason to use a gesture line for a dragon tail or a snake or hair or body, because they have more than one points of motion. They have lots and lots and lots of joints, creating the potential for really, really unique, specific movement. So we've talked a lot about stuff today. It's been all knowledge, really. Less application and more and less technique and more knowledge. So we've talked about the fact that you have to preserve the 3D, that you have to think about the anatomy, which meaning muscle versus bone. And you have to think about perspective, so the kind of angle that you're looking at. Are they stacking or are they not stacking? I didn't talk enough about this, but that's there. And then, of course, the gesture. But this is not the order. Let's talk about technique. This is all knowledge. This is the pool of stuff. Let's organize them in order. The first and most important thing that you do when you draw a hand, you have to draw the gesture. You have to capture the motion. All right? Because a hand has lots of points in which it can bend. Meaning you are going to have every single one of those bends, you have to capture it. And this goes without saying, use a reference. You cannot do this without a reference. You have to build a pool of knowledge in your mind you can pull from, and you can't do that without application. You can't do that without enough hand studies. It's an epidemic. Everyone's scared of drawing hands. Everyone hates drawing hands because there's just too much knowledge invested. I mean, they can barely draw a face and they're already drawing hands, and they sign off hands is the most difficult thing to draw. It's because really no one has given you any labels like this. This is why I said today I really want to focus on this specific stuff, because these are the specific labels you need in your life by now. You need in your life to make the thought of drawing a hand less scary. Because all you have to do is remember these specific things. You don't have to draw a hand out of your head right now. You can look at your reference. Just remember to read these and identify where they are in your reference. The gesture is a very specific gesture. 3 C's, 4 C's, and probably 1 S. 4 C's and 1 S, and you've captured it beautifully. And then on those 4 C's, so when you get the gesture line first, does anyone know what comes next? And I showed this list before, and this is what I give the list. This is the list I give for anatomy and figure drawing students I have in private tutoring, the same list that I give to you guys. Does anyone know what's next after you draw the gesture line? Contreras says, oh right, Istebrak, I was doing by the square and then you mentioned gesture line and presto. Nice. Can you show us, Patrick? Can you show us the drawing that you just did? I ain't scared. There's so much to remember all at once. That's true, Ineva. But the more that you come around to it, the more you think about it, the less daunting it is, because no one is asking you to draw a picture, draw a hand from your memory. No one is saying that's the way to be an artist. No one is saying your artistic caliber is diminished by your use of references. Actually, it's the exact opposite. Your artistic caliber is magnified, and you reach the potential with it. It works as a catalyst to your success. So using a reference is amazing. All I'm saying is have this as a list and just post it in front of your monitor, for fuck's sake. That might actually change your life. Write this list down and throw it on your monitor, or not this list, and you won't forget it ever again. It'll be just, it'll stay in your memory. Okay. I didn't used to have faith in this memory thing, but recently I picked up this workout sheet off Imager. It was like this long thing of workouts to do in the morning, and there was like 16 workouts on that. And after three, I was like, oh my God, I have to print this out and have it beside me and so I can remember all of this. How am I going to remember all of this? I swear to God, after a week of doing it, actually just doing the workouts, I memorized it. And not even a week, after like 2 days, I memorized those 15 moves that I have. I'm like, holy shit, I have to memorize this and this and this much time. It's just by doing it the first 2 times, and the pain of doing that workout, I remembered it instantly. So you gotta give your brains a chance. You gotta give your brains a chance to memorize this. Don't sign it off as excessive listing. Oh, I'll find my own technique. Oh, I'll find my own way to do hands. This is the way to do hands because it's the most anatomy friendly, realism friendly way. Meaning that you won't eventually draw distorted, weird looking long hands. You will eventually develop a really close to life, your way of drawing hands, which is really good. Okay, so cubes is next. Good job. That's what's next on the list. So the shapes, that's what's next. When you have a gesture line, and then you throw the cubes on top. So you throw the first cube of the hand on top. Just trying to think like a... Look, I'm trying to think in your way. I have my own cheaty way to do it. So you have that gesture, and I'm working off the gesture. By the way, you can embed the gesture into your shapes. You can embed the gesture line into your shapes. It's okay. It doesn't have to be a barbecue stick. The more, actually, if you do this, it's going to ensure an even more flowy gesture. So you guys can do that. The next step, though, this is what's tricky with hands. You have to find your landmarks. It really depends on how you think. But you have to remember that these landmarks are what you're going to have to look out for. If the hand bends, you have to show some knuckles. So you're probably going to either throw a circle on there or something to remind you that there is a landmark here that's needed to make the anatomy read. Landmark here, gesture for the thumb, gesture for the fingers. So what are these fingers doing? Alright, so this is something that I do. Let me show you what it is. I use it for hands, for arms, I use it for knees. Basically, this is where the joint is, and drawing this spring reminds me where the joint is. So this is something that I use for hands when I'm drawing arms, This shows me where the elbow is. And it really helps me keep my line efficiency, so I used 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 lines. Is that right? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 lines. That's really good. That's really good for an arm if you're only using as 5 strokes. That's really, really good. Try to make it even less. I don't know if I can do that. I'm kind of a noob. But this is something I can use for fingers as well. Oops. Yeah, it depends on where the knuckle comes out. So if I keep the knuckle pointing out, I remind myself, elbow needs a bone, knee needs a bone. So if I think about that, this is just my own way of thinking. Knee needs a bone. So this is me reminding myself, hey, this is a landmark. This is a really important part in the bending of this symmetry line and of this gesture line. I need it. The only problem with me letting you in on this little thing that I do is that you probably will draw a really stiff one. So I recommend filling a whole sheet up with really gestury springs. And try to just practice your way around them, making sure that they are equal. They're representing the arm, so this is longer than this. Upper arm is longer than forearm, sort of. And arms, if it's a knee, you make sure it's jutting out on the right side. Arms kind of have it jut out inside, inward, because that's where the elbow is. It's just an amazing little thing I've figured out that makes drawing arms a lot easier, because I used to draw arms very stiff. So I remind myself of this, and I get the sort of let me show you real quick what he does. I get the measurements down kind of right here, as he says. They kind of follow a very specific circle. So if you got your pencil and you put it on your wrist, the edge of your pencil, and you kind of moved around like a protractor, you'll kind of see what sits on the same level and what doesn't. This and this almost always sit on the same level. This is the highest, of course. And memorizing which ones are the highest is going to be a lot easier for you. So it's just, again, a matter of finding the landmarks, drawing the middle finger first. And you know, hey, since this is the middle finger and this is the longest, I know everything else is a step down. Sometimes the index is longer than the index is longer than the ring finger. And the pinky, of course, is the smallest. You can start with the pinky and work outside from that. So it's a lot of it is a technique, as you can see. You have your own ways of making the process of capturing a three-dimensional object onto a two-dimensional surface easier. You have a ton of ways. But the knowledge stays the same. The knowledge doesn't change. You can rearrange it as much as you want. I've never seen anyone draw a gesture line last. But you can rearrange it and do whatever you need to do. But this, I promise, works. After you draw the shapes, you have to remember what part of the shapes you're drawing first. So me, I kind of just put bones and muscle in the same stroke. Remember I showed you by not blending certain areas, you've already drawn the skeleton. And by blending certain areas, you've already drawn the muscle. So I'm already thinking about that. But for you guys, I want you to get used to differentiating between muscle and kind of like stuff that isn't muscle, in the fact that sometimes muscle blends into fat, is what I'm trying to say. So finding the difference between, again, let's just say make it two, bone and muscle / fat. That way you guys aren't thinking too much about squishy versus hard. So when I do the shapes, I'm thinking about the bone plus the muscle. But over here, separate them. After you draw the shapes, after you draw the sort of the 90-degree angle, break that 90-degree angle and find the areas that are blended. So find the areas that are more obtuse, that are more blended. So blend, basically. Start rendering. Gesture lines, shapes, and then your detail. And detail comes out of shrinking your brush and cleaning up what your large brush has done. And this is all large brush. Large brush. Small brush, of course, for gesture lines. And then large brush, medium, small, and then smaller, and then even smaller, until you get to the fine little detail on the nail. But you always have to zoom back out to make sure that the shadows and the shades that you've thrown on while you were detailing here, so this is all shades. While you were detailing at this stage, you're making sure you're not messing around with the shades you threw in here. And you're not disrupting the shape you drew here. And you're not deviating outside of the gesture line completely, because you guys do that. You guys draw a gesture line and then you forget about it like it was yesterday's newspaper. You guys completely forget about it. You draw a gesture line and then you draw a body standing right up. Or you draw a gesture line of someone like flying or something, like a beautiful flying person, and then you draw like a, I don't know, like a Superman kind of thing. And then I see you guys drawing like the head all the way down here when you throw the head on, and then like the shoulders somewhere completely away from the gesture line is showing not only the movement of the joints where the body is bending, remember the bends, the pivots, but also it's representing the motion, the actual kinetic energy, where this person is going, whether or not it's an open or closed gesture. Because if you don't know what I'm saying with open or closed, my books on my website talk about that a lot. If you guys are confused, the book that talks about it the most is Figure Drawing for the Growing Artist. It's available on my website. I'll show you guys later. So let's talk about this hand. This hand had a reference to it, and I'm not sure. I hope you know that this is a male's hand. And make sure not to throw female signifiers or attempt to use this as a female's hand. Female hands, female gestures versus male gestures. Females have, at least from animating discipline or a cartooning background, you want to give females more gesture line pivot points or motions or points of motion than a male character. Females have more of a spaghetti, like past the string kind of motion to them when they walk and act, versus men that have more of a uncut pasta. That's from anatomy. I mean animating and animation, anatomy, and drawing cartoons. So that's like exaggerating and caricatures. But look out for those anyway when you're drawing females. What I see here is a lack of the pivot points, a lack of the edges. You see this point and this point. They're actual, like you can see them in the photograph. They're actual points where we have a real measurable bend. 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 These are no joke. I know you guys think that, okay, if I draw long enough, it'll eventually look good, but that's not how it works. These are actual joints, bends. We have to look out for those in our drawing. So you've got these because they were on the outside. Your brain, your beautiful brain that has only lines in it, said, hey, 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 this is a bend. Let's get this one. But how about this one? And this one? And this really, really important one right over here. These are really what make the difference in drawing the hand. By showing, exemplifying the battle between flesh and bone. That's why hands are so difficult. They're so tiny and tedious, and they need so much attention, and they're a test of everything. That's why they say when you draw a hand, you can draw anything. It's true. By the time you learn how to draw a hand, you've learned about three-dimensional rules. You've learned about the form. You've learned about the gesture line. You've learned about pretty much everything. So I applied very, very little corrections, but I applied them along that kind of model. And the hand reads a lot better after that. Before, after. A lot more edgy, less sausage-like. Especially because we didn't blend here. Look out for this one. We didn't blend it. I kept this blended because it eventually becomes fatty. But the more you go down, the more of an angle you get. Remember this. This is something Burne Hogarth covers a lot. Let's see where he does it. Right along here. This line bends into this. This becomes blended completely. He's kind of tried to show you the guide, the general guide, but this all blends. This is the underlying cube. This is all underneath, and on top of it is all blending. But over here, it's preserved. If the person lost completely, let me see if I can just experiment. If the person lost all the fat, of course it would look like a skeleton, but you would see. I don't know if I can spell this right. Anorexic hand. Yeah, you can really see where those little knuckles are. And you see a lot more of a prevalent edge in this hand. So there isn't any decent lighting. Okay, here, that's beautiful. You see how before I told the guy you can't have the edge right in the middle? Because there needs to be some fat. The fat here is completely gone. And so the edge has become so prevalent, it's cut across right half. At the halfway point. It's kind of very sad. But that's kind of the extreme end of it. When you're so skinny, your tendons actually look like you've peeled the skin. Because again, there's no fat padding here to blend all of this out. So you look at it as if you peeled the skin and looking only at the tendons and the muscles. There's no more fat. You can see the bend in between the bone. You know how the bone is hollow for the forearm? You can actually see it. Terrible, terrible disease. Okay? So show some bone and show some muscle and know the difference in between both. So that when you draw the hand, it actually looks like it's functioning and behaving like a real hand would, of course. So any questions? Can anyone repeat the list that I wrote down? So this hand, I didn't finish painting it. It's too much to cover, but before, after, a little closer for a read, because we've blended these little areas. Yes. And then this one, I didn't really paint over it. Yeah, or maybe it was a female or a male, you can't really tell. Gestures, and then the cubes. And then the shades of the cubes, but you don't throw the shades of the cubes unless you know what the cubes were representing, fat properties or skeletal properties. So when you draw the cubes, after you draw the gesture line, make sure you know what you're drawing the cubes for. Don't just draw cubes willy-nilly. Make sure you're reading your reference. And of course, always use your reference. You cannot live without one for now. If you want to draw hands in the future, freestyling and without the use of a reference, you got to work with references now. Or else in the future you'll draw a face like to the hair well, but you're gonna just be all your paintings are just gonna be faces. You're not gonna have any hands in there like mine was, because you're just gonna be too scared to draw hands. It's not gonna be on the same skill level as a face. Do you guys want that? No. You don't want to be a one-trick pony. So good luck with your homework. I will see you guys on Thursday. Have a great night, you guys. Bye bye.